Mondays with Mike is a podcast by two friends from the Seattle area. Originally intended as a news analysis podcast, as of spring 2025, it has lately mostly covered current events. Show notes can be found at mondayswithmike.ddns.net. Mondays with Mike is your weekly helping of opinion and critical analysis of the day's news. Bud asks the questions, and Mike supplies the takes. Start a social revolution. Make friends with your neighbor. Disagree without being disagreeable. And remember, if it's Mondays, it's with Mike. Mondays with Mike. Here we resume our discussion from last week.
It's going to be a bumpy ride for 2025. If other countries stop liking us enough because of the guy that was elected into office and the things that he's doing, that affects brand America. And that's really tough to regain if other countries offer better opportunities for tourists to travel to.
Bumpy ride for 2025.
It's still, yes, it still is a bumpy ride for 2025.
Yes.
I'll also say, though, the way that they're doing immigration enforcement, it sends a terrible message to tourists and people who show up to the United States, because people are human. They occasionally make mistakes. And it shouldn't be that if somebody makes a mistake as a tourist and they show up to the country, that they are thrown in a jail or sent to a foreign prison for a while if it's a paperwork error or if it's administrative error. And even then, here's the other issue. The conditions of the detention should be pristine. They should be so great because these are future potential tourists. You don't want to give them a horrible impression of the hospitality of the United States, because then they'll tell all their friends and their family and anyone they come in contact with who will listen, oh, not only does the U.S. not want tourists here because they're treating people terribly who make mistakes, but when they make the mistakes, they're making it so horrific, so unpleasant, so uncomfortable that it's just not worth it to spend thousands of dollars flying on a plane across an ocean, to spend thousands of dollars in a hotel or going to a theme park, or spending months at a time living in a country that respects your money and your time and your presence so little, right? That they're actively chasing people away. That's the whole thing. That's the gripe I have right now with how this whole saga is playing out. For some reason, and this boggles my mind, Trump owns hotels. He owns resorts. Like, he understands how important tourists are to making money if you own hotels. Like, I don't get it, or why they're so fixated on this issue of making it so cruel and so unpleasant, while at the same time wanting to increase the U.S. economy and give people jobs and bring down the prices, etc. You don't do that if you make the economy worse.
What about the Supreme Court? Trump had some wins here. They ruled he can use wartime powers to deport gang members. He can use the Enemy Aliens Act from the 1700s. But they also ruled that deportees must receive advance notice and the opportunity for a legal challenge. Yeah, that part seemed pretty basic to me. You're a gang member. No, I'm not. I challenged this legally. Nope, you can't challenge it legally. If you can't challenge it legally, then you don't have the right to a fair trial. And we need people to have the right to a fair trial. What do you think about this?
The whole reason they're using the Alien Enemies Act is so that they don't have a trial, that they can designate a group of people as part of a foreign invasion or incursion, or as part of a hostile nation, and they can just kick them out. That's always been the issue right now in terms of U.S. jurisprudence, is that the government has the ability to categorize a certain class of people as being exempt from what we would call regular due process. And you saw that play out with enemy combatants in Gitmo. The whole reason that they're saying that these individuals need an opportunity to be heard in court for the charges against them comes out of a case that was set from Gitmo from the Supreme Court of Hamdi versus the United States, of that everybody needs a habeas petition, right? That the court has to be able to hear. Do you know what a habeas corpus petition is?
Where's the body?
Yeah, present the body, right?
Yeah.
What are the charges? Why am I here? How long am I going to be here? And the whole issue with the thing that they're doing now and the issue with the Alien Enemies Act and how they're using it is that if you move them to a foreign country, they're violating a whole slew of constitutional protections that are supposed to exist for people, like knowing what the evidence against you is, being able to confront your accusers, having a redress of grievances. It's really hard to get a lawyer to fight for you in the U.S. legal system if you're in El Salvador. Turns out it's really difficult if you're locked up in a maximum security prison designed for really high level criminals to actually communicate with anyone in the outside world. And because it's a foreign country, the Trump administration gets to do what they've been doing, saying, oh, not in our jurisdiction anymore, not our problem. I don't know. Apparently, it is their problem if they make mistakes. The whole argument that it's just out of their control completely, I'm not going to swear, but it's nonsense. The government of the U.S. is paying El Salvador, this is publicly known, money to have these individuals detained in that prison in El Salvador. I'm sure when they hammered out that agreement, there had to have been some inclusion that if we want our people back, or if we want the people we're sending you back, you will send them back.
One would assume, yeah.
There's no way the U.S. is just, maybe there is, I hope this is not the case, that the U.S. is effectively sending people without a charge, a trial, or a conviction of being found guilty in a court of law to hard labor or multi-years long detention in some foreign prison. Because this is what boggles my mind. I don't understand. You can deport somebody, right? If they're in the country illegally, you can send them back to their country of origin or some other place, whatever. I'm not even so sure the some other place thing even is something you can do unless you're sending them to a refugee camp or something. There are all sorts of international covenants and charters and human rights laws that the U.S. agreed to or signed on to that say that everybody has certain basic human rights that you're supposed to respect. And this one in particular is really appalling because if they're detaining people without convicting them of a crime, they're effectively saying that they can snatch anybody they want up as long as they use the magic words of gang member or whatever the word is that they use and throw them in a prison for a long time with no recourse, or like with no way to appeal it because how do you appeal a charge or a conviction if there was no conviction? You never had a trial, right? So what's going on? Here's the whole thing. When you are charged with a crime and you're sentenced for a crime, at the end of it, when you make a plea deal or you go through the whole trial process and you're found guilty, you know explicitly what your sentence is. They will tell you. They'll say 5 years in prison, 10 years in prison, whatever the sentence is for people who commit felonies or misdemeanors if they get jail time. In this case, it doesn't appear that any of these people are even being told this is how long you'll be in prison. This is how long you'll be detained. Here's why you've been sent to this prison. If that's not happening, then what the U.S. effectively is doing is just sending people into a memory hole. Did you see in the Social Security Administration where they're declaring 6,000 people dead so that they can't use the Social Security numbers they were issued to work in the U.S. and pay taxes?
Are they dead?
No, they're not dead.
Okay, then that's wrong.
If the government officially declares someone dead, it means they can't access things like a bank, a credit card, you can't get a loan, you can't get a job.
You'd go to court and say, I'm not dead, look at me.
But if the government is purposefully declaring people dead, how do you challenge that if they don't acknowledge your existence? That's the whole issue.
I do not know the particular legal remedy, no.
You have to have standing, right? In order to challenge something in court, you can't have standing if the government doesn't think you're alive. And so this is a sort of Orwellian, Kafkaesque kind of thing. Have you ever read the trial from Kafka where the guy goes to court and it's like, why am I here? And they're like, oh, no, no, no. And then they just move him around without actually telling him why he's there, and they just keep.
No, I haven't read it, but I've read many allusions to it, so I think I get it.
It's a great read if you haven't read it of what the issues are with not having things like due process or basic fundamental rights that we respect for everyone. Because look, this whole issue is just a mess. Because frankly, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, slavery is only legal if someone's convicted of a crime. Conviction. If there's no conviction and they're sending people to effectively a place they cannot leave, and if they're required to do any kind of labor and they're not paid for it, slavery, right, then the U.S. is violating the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, right? It's not even, there's no ambiguity here. That's why the Supreme Court had a 9-0 decision of get the guy back. They only applied it to the one guy who the government admitted there was administrative error. But the same argument applies to virtually everyone there. The Alien Enemies Act doesn't say you can deport people to detention. If you read the Alien Enemies Act, there's actually a whole bunch of explicit provisions of things that you have to give the people as they're leaving. You have to give them all their property, all their stuff. You have to afford them the opportunity to peaceably leave, right? Just because they can kick people out doesn't mean that they can kick people out in the manner that they're kicking them out. And that's, I think, what's being lost in this conversation a lot. And what irks me about how the media covers it is when they say initially, when they were talking about this topic, they're saying, oh, they're just deporting gang members or they're just deporting criminals or murderers or whatever. How do you know that if you haven't actually convicted them of that crime? You haven't presented any evidence of that. That's what irks me, is that just the media without saying allegedly or
Yeah, you got to say allegedly.
at least, right? Because that's the whole point. Unless you've been convicted in a court of law with evidence presented against you, a jury or a bench trial, whatever the process, unless you've been explicitly convicted, the government can say whatever they want. They can paint whatever label they want on you. You're not officially that until they actually prove it. That's how it's supposed to work, because otherwise the whole problem exists that they just start again pointing to anybody they see and going, we don't like that person, so that person's a gang member. Kick them out of the country. And where it gets really egregious is if they started using it against American citizens, because there's a law and a fundamental understanding in international humanitarian law that you can't on-citizen a person. You can't remove the citizenship of somebody if they're born somewhere and make them stateless. Because the whole issue, if you make someone stateless, is then they become subject to the whims of all countries. And there was a whole debate about some of the issues with the policies that were being applied. I don't remember the exact topic, was that they harm stateless people and that there's very little recourse that stateless people have in our current system to be heard, to have their rights respected. It's just terrible. And their opponent stood up and said, stateless people aren't a thing. They don't exist. And it's, what are you talking? After the fact, I say, you can't just deny the existence of people, and their opponent called them out.
If I can point to someone who is stateless, you can't say there aren't stateless people.
Exactly. That was the whole argument. Stateless people have some rights, and they are affected in a negative way more so than people who are citizens of countries, because they have less power and leverage. But you can't, in an argument, say that people just aren't real when you can see them. Right? Like,
yeah.
That was
right. As such, it would be pretty befuddling if I was told, hey, you don't get Social Security because you're dead. I'm not dead. Look at me. There's got to be...
The whole issue here is the government gave them Social Security numbers so they could pay taxes. They knew it. And so the government then reneging on this group of people, because the whole issue with the illegal immigration is that they're undocumented. These were individuals who became documented because they went through the process and they were told you have to do this in order to work, get paid, pay taxes. And then the government, with one fell swoop, says, nope, you're not really people. You don't get to exist anymore in our system. We're going to just declare you dead. And now, you can self-deport in any manner. Because the whole point of what they're trying to do is they're trying to get people to leave, to self-deport. And the only reason they know who the people are to tell to self-deport is because the government gave them the Social Security numbers. They didn't just magically acquire the Social Security. No, the government gave it to them so they could pay taxes. So this goes back to that revenue thing we were talking about. It really sucks for getting government revenue and paying down the debt if the people who are supposed to be paying their taxes all of a sudden can't, because they make it impossible to do so because they declare thousands of them dead. You can't collect taxes from a dead person. I guess you could from their estate, but they're not dead. They're not actually
dead. They don't
dead.
have an estate. Yeah, this is pretty ridiculous. People need access to the criminal justice system, and you can't say they're dead if they're not dead.
Is it
Go ahead.
justice? Yeah, is it justice if there is no finding of guilt? And also,
Yeah.
are they actually criminals? Criminal is a specific term of somebody who has committed a crime, but to prove that somebody's committed a crime, you have to actually show that they did. I guess that's a semantic distinction. People are criminals when they commit crimes.
That's an interesting one. Are they criminals if they commit the crime, or are they criminals if they are convicted of the crime? That's an interesting one. I don't know. Hard to say.
I think it's the first one.
Really.
They're
Okay.
they're prisoner. How do I phrase this? They're felons if they're convicted of a crime and found guilty. Jean Valjeans of the world, who get thrown in jail and put on parole and all that. They're criminal. The criminal is just somebody who commits the act that is a crime. So if somebody speeds 100 miles an hour in a 50-mile-an-hour speed limit and they're not caught, they're still driving recklessly.
There's a fact of the matter as to what happened. And so, in that sense, yes. But it would be inaccessible to people. If somebody saw it, it would be accessible to them. But anyone could say that they saw it, and you wouldn't know, so you can't exactly point to an individual and say conclusively they did it if they weren't convicted of it. So you have to say allegedly. Nevertheless, there is the realm of facts.
But that's also why evidence is so important, why they need this due process. They also need to be able to challenge the accusation. But the whole issue here is also, I guess it's technically a crime to be part of a gang, right?
Oh, okay.
Because of things like RICO.
I was just going to joke, oh, I'll just send in my dissociation from XYZ gangs. No, just kidding. I'm not in any gangs.
It is technically illegal, I think, I'm not a lawyer, but I think if you think of terrorist organizations, for example, if somebody is a member of that group, then it's usually illegal because of the fact that they're participating in or endorsing the actions of the group. And so that one is tricky. Here's my issue. The standard for deportation is lower than finding someone guilty of a crime and throwing them in jail. It just is. It's lower, but there has to be a standard. They can't just point at someone and then just throw them out of the country without any proof. They're not even figuring out if any of these people have asylum claims or refugee status. That's my other issue with this process thing, is that if they don't give them advance notice and they don't give them a hearing, how do you figure out if someone like the guy who wasn't supposed to be deported to El Salvador is being deported to El Salvador? He already went through the process and he already got an order from the court that said, no, don't send him to El Salvador, period. No ifs, ands, or buts. There are no exceptions. Do not do it. I do think it's really important. I think the Supreme Court's right on this decision that there has to be a hearing and advance notice, right? You give people a chance to get their affairs in order, but also the opportunity to get a lawyer, to get a hearing, whatever. But also, I'm not thrilled with the fact that the Supreme Court gave any kind of wiggle room for the administration to not just bring the guy back, because they said they have to facilitate his return, which doesn't mean make him return. It just means make it more likely that he return, make the conditions such that he can return by asking El Salvador or something.
So I was at Safeco Field and I wanted to buy a beer, but apparently it was the top of the 8th inning, and now you can't buy beer in the 8th inning. It used to be. You can't buy it in the 9th inning. That I understand. That I get. The 8th inning, come on, folks. And I just said, I thought about it for a while and I came up with a saying. It's like my grandfather didn't fight in World War II so that I could be withheld from buying a beer in the top of the 8th inning. And that's partially a joke, but it's also true, but it's partially a joke. Okay, this one's not a joke, though. My grandfather fought in World War II so that we would live in a world of laws. World War II was fought to save future humans from living in the realm of legal arbitrarity. Because that's the kind of world you would have got if the other guys had won World War II. So that we could live in a world where we would, and there's a degree of predictability here, but more importantly, justice. where we are secure in our persons and where our neighbors are secure in their persons. So people say, what, do you want not to deport the gang members? No, go ahead and deport the gang members, but make sure you are deporting the gang members and show it. Because worse than having gangs about would be having a state of arbitrarity.
Yeah, do you know the issue? This happened in Germany, actually, where the whole issue is that if you don't make an effort to prove it, then anybody can accuse anybody else for whatever reasons they have of, oh, say you're a store owner and you run a market stall and you've got a competitor who runs another market stall in a farmer's market and you sell similar products and they're your direct competitor, and so you view them as a rival. If anybody can lobby an accusation without actually proving the accusation true, then the government will just swoop in and go, oh, okay, I agree. That person's a gang member because he said it, and then deport him. Then all of a sudden, it makes vendetta a much easier thing to do in the US. Have you ever heard that phrase, a lie can make it around the world before the truth?
Truth has a chance to put its shoes on, yes.
In this case, if these lies happen or these issues occur, that's why I have a gripe with they have a phone number that you can call now to just report people to ICE. It's like, if they don't have a standard for actually proving these accusations true, then it's just a recipe for disaster. But the whole point is that it's making vendetta way easier of just if people are romantic rivals, like Romeo and Juliet or something.
Like in Lawrence of Arabia, where they're like, then what if I do this? And Lawrence says, then you will have a blood feud. We don't want to live in a country where the people are running around with blood feuds. We want the law to take care of it, and there has to be predictability.
Yeah, and mistakes get made. People who are citizens, for instance, can get caught up in this thing. If all they're going off of for arresting people and sending them to El Salvador is things like tattoos or wearing certain types of clothing, come on. There has to be a better standard than that when you're sending someone thousands of miles away into a notorious prison where people suffer, and you're throwing in people who haven't been convicted of a crime in with people who have been convicted of crimes. But even look, deporting them or not, that's one issue. The other issue is just don't. Why are they getting sent to this prison at all? Come up with some other place to send them that isn't a prison. Send them to some refugee camp or some third place that's a safe harbor, but not explicitly cruel, that puts them at risk of life and limb, because the government already admitted that it's made mistakes. So this is cruel, it's inhumane. It goes back to that brand America thing. Why would people want to show up as tourists to the country if there's even a possibility or a risk of the government making such a egregious mistake and throwing them in a prison for a while? Like, why risk it? There's other countries aren't going to do that.
Online gambling. NBC News reported that there was somebody who gambled online. They reported on this on April 8th. There we go. They reported that somebody had lost an online gambling bet for $10,000 and then committed suicide. And they reported some alarming statistics. First of all, it turns out that people who are most vulnerable for this are men between 18 and 34. Makes sense. Particularly before, age 27, there's a kind of risk-taking there. And after that, people become more predictable in their behaviors. But there's a risk-taking, there's a thrill-seeking, there's searching out if there are quick gains to be had in the world. And apparently, according to NBC News' reporting, 20% of high-risk problem gamblers have attempted suicide. Seems like a lot, and too many. I'm not saying that seems like an overestimation. It does seem like very high, but that seems like a very bad thing. And it was said on the segment, the guy who was being interviewed, whose friend who had committed suicide, when do you think that people are going to wake up with respect to online gambling, and he replied, "When enough people have killed themselves." Very sad, very bad for our society. So, speaking of Safeco Field, maybe I'm just becoming an old man here, wagging my finger at things. But there's so many ads for casinos these days. This is not. I don't think this is great. Maybe I'm being too much of a moralist here. Am I being too much of a moralist here? This seems like a crisis to me. Big crisis.
The crisis seems to be one of self-control, right? And you see this for all sorts of things, drug use, you see this for any number of other alcohol, right? That it's a crisis of, for whatever reason, there's some amount of people that find it very difficult to stop once they've started something that is addictive. That is something that's an ongoing debate and discussion that's been happening for my entire lifetime about addiction in particular of and we see this play out with the drug war where for a long time they would be throwing people in jail for small amounts of drugs and throwing them in prison so that they wouldn't use instead of putting them in rehabilitation or something like that. This is a similar kind of thing, except the way I look at this is it was the difference between prohibition and legal alcohol use. That if it's not legal, then it's even more unregulated. And so the issue I find is that yes, there are risk taking behaviors here, but if it's not legal, then the risks become more than just suicide from having a bad bet. And that's terrible. It's awful that happened. The risks also become organized crime, loan sharks, huge amounts of murders in the street, and property crimes. And that, like, a whole list of negative factors occur when gambling was illegal. Because lest we forget, one of the wealthiest criminals of all time was Al Capone, and one facet of his empire, aside from the alcohol, was gambling, was providing spaces for people to gamble. So the worry here, as with almost all of these things related to addiction, it's part of the reason I think casinos are regulated and are legal, is that you either have a space for people to engage in this behavior legally in a regulated manner, or the alternative is that people are still going to engage in this behavior. We're just not going to know about it. And so we can't adequately study it and come up with better ways to address it. I will say in terms of online gambling, the big issue is actually with its accessibility. So to go to a casino, you have to physically go there. You have to go through security. You have to be scrutinized, and there are limits that are set within the casino, and it differs based on casino how much you can spend, how much you can buy, like the amounts of risks that you're allowed to take before they cut you off. For online gambling, the risk taking is way too easy, right? That there's a lot less barriers. And so in that respect, I will say it's a huge issue. And I don't think you're being a moralist on this one. The issue, obviously gambling is an issue in the sense that people take risks that can result in very negative outcomes. But I've seen stories about the stock market that were similar, of a guy who was doing, I think he was shorting stocks or doing calls or something on stocks and lost just exorbitant sums of money.
You can definitely lose more on the stock market. The difference I would say is that the stock market is not rigged against you. You might not know like what the dynamics. Okay, not like a casino. Let's even just accept that it is rigged against you. A casino is more rigged against you.
Yeah, so the manner of business for a casino is that you can win, but the odds are not meant to make it so you will win. In this,
Long term, enough repeat plays, you won't win. Yeah.
yeah, but casinos are highly regulated. They go under extreme scrutiny to make sure that all of their machines actually pay out. There's a whole list of like regulatory things that go into casinos to make sure that they're actually being fair, in the sense that they tell you ahead of time what are the odds for any fixed odds of winning. It's where the variability is in the stuff like poker, and it's stuff where there isn't like a predictable outcome, that there's some variance. That's where it gets really messy. But no, I agree that casinos explicitly, they want to make money, and they make
Right.
money by getting people who will just gamble over and over and over and over again, because the most successful gambler is the one who makes one bet, wins more money than they spent,
And then stops.
never ever gambles again. It's about restraint and self control, and it's very clear from looking at the breakdown of addiction in the country and some of the issues that arise from alcoholism, drug use, substance addiction, video game addiction, that there's some subset of the population, for whatever reason, can't stop once they start. That usually what makes them stop is some really terrible outcome, like running out of money, or
And sometimes not even then.
sometimes not even then. But the point is that for whatever reason, there's some issue with self control that people can't stop. And gambling is particularly terrible because it affords people the opportunity to not only lose all their money, but where they get into real trouble is when they take out loans or they take on debt. Because then not only are you losing money when you bet and lose the bet, you're also digging yourself into a deeper hole because you have to figure out ways to pay off your loans. And when people can't pay off their loans, bad things happen. You get bankruptcies, you get the eventually people get their credit scores go down, or they get locked out of being able to rent or buy a home, or in some cases your credit score and your financial history is looked at for getting a job. A big thing they look at for security clearances actually is if somebody's a gambler or if they have any financial debts, because it provides leverage over somebody if they owe a lot of money to a lot of people, right? That they may be more inclined to do things that are, let's call it, bad for national security if they have an extreme gambling addiction.
There are contests or endeavors of skill, and there are contests or endeavors of luck. And it is a spectrum as well, but let's just consider. But gambling is not about skill much at all. Poker more about skill than other things, but still, it's kind of like, guess if you went into crime, you could be the next Al Capone, you could make it big, but 1 in a million, you're probably just gonna die. But, so, gambling, most of the gambling we're talking about, nobody's got a crystal ball. You're betting on sporting events, you don't know what the outcome of those sporting events are. Maybe college football sometimes, but even then, no. Even then, no, not really.
There could be a protest, or somebody runs on the field, or a meatball from the sky and hit first base. Like, you don't know. That's
Absolutely, you don't know. You absolutely don't know. Yeah, somebody, like the star player gets arrested before the game, or something.
It happens. Hey, it happens.
Yeah.
It really does. Yeah. So the roundabout way of saying, like, for right now, if I generally were to purchase index funds, yeah, most of the time those go up. And most people who are pretty risk averse even will be fine with doing that. But I'm not. I am like, no, I could lose it. I'm going to do this instead. And I'm a little bit too risk averse.
Spread out over like thousands of stocks, you're getting like a tiny fractional share of the risk is there, but it's the same kind of risk of like total collapse of the market risk. Yeah, if you park your money in a bank and the bank fails, then you could lose your money, but the odds of the bank failing are like Lehman Brothers versus all the other banks. Like, I get that, yes, it could happen, and
you get FDIC too. You get FDIC.
Federal Deposit Insurance.
I understand, but there's a reason the FDIC exists, because there was a time when you didn't. Those people lost all their money. Anyways, it is interesting that when you're talking about something like index funds or the stock market, you go, oh, I don't want to engage in like those levels of risk. Do you drive a car?
Yeah, exactly. Because I can't. I need the car to interface with the number of things, but you're right, that is a bigger risk.
Yes.
The risk of, if you look at the top 10 causes of death in the world, road injury, right up there in the top 10, right? If you walk on a sidewalk, if you drive a car, if you get on a bus, if you fly a plane, if you go at any kind of, specifically it's the car driving, Like the risks there are way higher of some kind of road injury. Like I got into an accident. It happens. I didn't like it. I was unhappy after the accident. I broke my hand. That was bad. I had to be in a cast for 6 months. Clearly, I don't want to take that level of risk. But though I get what you're saying, right? That I think I get what you're saying. That
so there's these risks. There's already enough risks in life. There's risks in almost everything. So some people take that information, knowing there's risk in anything, and it's like, there's risk in gambling, but I could make a lot of money quickly. And the way they reason is, if I win, I'll double my money. And that's their reasoning. And it's like, no, wrong calculus. Wrong calculus. Stop right there. Anyway, but I like what you've said. So even knowing all this and being as risk averse as I am, except I exclude automobiles from the calculus. Yeah. Even being as risk averse as I am, I still don't think Las Vegas should be shut down, because it's over there. You can travel on a plane to get to it, and that's okay with me.
Also, there are physical barriers, right? There are the whole issue that I see with online gambling is that there's very little barrier to entry. That somebody can get an app or whatever and they're off to the races. To go to a casino, you have to physically go there. That's why some states ban online gambling, period. I'm pretty sure Washington's one of them.
I wanted to place small bets that the Las Vegas Raiders, very small, like $10, as little as I could, that the Las Vegas Raiders would win any of the next, or one of the next 7 Super Bowls when I hired Pete Carroll, and I looked online, how do I do this? They're like, you can't do that. I'm like, oh, guess I can't do it. Too bad.
Yeah, not in Washington State.
Yeah.
So anyways, the whole point is some states still do outright, like it's a felony to gamble online in some states. I think Washington is or was one of them. I'm not sure if they've moved it down to a misdemeanor or if it's still illegal, but I know for a fact that, at least because I looked up the laws on this, and and the reason why is this issue that we're talking about, the problem gambling, the gambling addiction, the suicides, is because it was destroying families, right? That you'd have the breadwinners of families who would get these gambling addictions, and then they'd bet the mortgage, they'd bet the college tuition, they'd bet the food money, they'd bet the car money, all the things. The reason the government has an interest in this, frankly, has to do with child support and welfare payments. If a person becomes a ward of the state, has to assume the cost for that person. And a person becomes a ward of the state when their parents are no longer able to take care of them, and the state has to intervene. Or there's issues when there's child support payments, and the state has to sue people to pay for child support. If someone doesn't pay the child support, then they have to throw them in jail, it's silly that you want someone to pay child support and the response when they don't is you throw them in jail. Why not let them work I guess if you're throwing them in jail, do it during the weekend or something, let them work so they can pay off the debt that they owe the state, right?
If they must go to jail, that's not a bad idea, but it isn't that they must go to jail.
Yeah, but it's silly there, right? Because the government not only wants money from someone, but they also are paying money to imprison someone. So they're losing on both ends, right? Yeah. They're losing the money and they're losing by having to imprison someone and all the legal expenses associated with throwing someone in jail.
This exciting discussion continues next week on Mondays with Mike. We'll see you next week here on Mondays with Mike.